Canada is staring down the barrel of economic catastrophe, and Donald Trump is holding the gun. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. Trump's brutal tariff war might just be the best thing that ever happened to Canada's economy. While the world watches Trump destroy decades of trade relationships with his reckless tariff obsession, Canada is quietly building something extraordinary, a completely new economic foundation that doesn't depend on America at all. We're talking about a fundamental transformation. On February 1st, 2025, a trade war between the US, Canada, and Mexico began when President Donald Trump signed orders imposing near-universal tariffs on goods from the two countries entering the United States. The order called for 25% tariffs on all imports from Mexico and all imports from Canada except for oil and energy, which would be taxed at 10%. But what Trump didn't count on was that his economic warfare would force Canada to do something it should have done decades ago: break free from America's economic stranglehold. The numbers reveal the scale of this dependency. Nearly 80% of Canadian exports are sent to the US. Canada's reliance on a few key industries, energy, automotive, and metals, further entrenches this dependency. For decades, this massive vulnerability made Canada hostage to every American political whim. But Trump's tariff tantrum has finally given Canada the wake-up call it desperately needed. The legal challenges to Trump's approach expose a fundamental constitutional crisis. Trump is the first president to ever attempt this kind of economic warfare through emergency powers.
The history of the enactment of that law has ever tried to use it for tariffs. In fact, President Trump himself, during his first 4 years, implemented tariffs, but he did it under the right statutes, the statutes that every other president has used to implement tariffs. So it's pretty simple. If it was so good to use it now, why not have used it during his first 4 years? And why hasn't any other president tried to use it? And why has Congress filed briefs in the court saying, hey, we didn't grant you this power? Additionally, you have judges at multiple levels of our courts disagreeing with the president. And you have judges that were one of them that was even appointed by the president, and a couple of others that were appointed by Republicans. So you have this diversity of legal scholars, and you have the history of how this law has been used that really kind of show that the president has overstepped his bounds.
Multiple judges, including those appointed by Trump himself, have ruled that the Constitution grants Congress the power to impose tariffs, not the president through emergency declarations. This unprecedented overreach reveals just how desperate and legally questionable Trump's entire trade strategy has become. Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, isn't backing down. Instead, he's doing something revolutionary. He's using Trump's aggression as fuel to rebuild Canada's entire economy. In his landmark speech, he emphasized that the global economy is not undergoing a transition, but a rupture, as the U.S. fundamentally transforms all of its trading relationships. We are over the shock, but we should never forget the lessons. We have to look out for ourselves, and we have to take care of each other, Carney said, noting that Canada would build a new economic and security relationship with the U.S., while diversifying its trade relationships. This isn't just political rhetoric. Carney is putting massive money behind his words. We will inject $5 billion into a new trade diversification corridor fund to build the infrastructure that will help diversify our trade partners, create good jobs, and drive economic growth. This fund will accelerate nation-building projects at ports, railroads, inland terminals, airports, and highways. This will build one Canadian economy and diversify our trade away from the United States. But Trump couldn't leave well enough alone. When Canada started fighting back with retaliatory tariffs, Trump completely lost control. Today, President Trump signed an executive order increasing the tariff on Canada from 25% to 35%, with the higher tariff set to go into effect on August 1st, 2025. Think about that for a moment. Trump escalated a trade war with America's closest ally simply because he dared to defend themselves. Trump's desperate attempts to rally allies against China reveal just how isolated America has become.
Well, you're right. There's not much for us in this, and I would say that this is happening after Donald Trump had a disastrous summit with Putin in Alaska, and after he saw the Indian Prime Minister Modi go to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit that took place in Tianjin 2 weeks ago, which was clearly China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and India getting together to thumb their nose at Trump. So I think what is interesting, it's an admission on the part of Trump that he needs help to achieve his goal. And I think there is an opening for Canada and allies to say, okay, if you need our help, well, let's work together. But we need to be clear on what exactly we are trying to achieve here.
After his disastrous summit with Putin in Alaska and watching the Shanghai Cooperation Organization unite China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and India against American interests, Trump is now begging NATO allies to impose tariffs on China. This is an admission that he needs help to achieve his goals, but allies are using this weakness to negotiate better terms for themselves rather than blindly following his demands. The coordination between America's neighbors shows how Trump's aggression is backfiring. Canada and Mexico are now coordinating their response to American trade aggression.
So I think what we're looking at in Mexico is not really negotiating a new deal, partly because Canada still has both the CUSMA agreement that includes Mexico, but also the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which includes both Canada and Mexico as parties. So there's already a significant amount of market access. What we're likely to be focused on is Canada and Mexico aligning on strategy in terms of handling the American disruptions and handling bilateral trade between the two parties that are separated by this kind of buffer state of the United States, because there is still a reasonably large amount of trade that happens bilaterally between the two countries.
With the trade that does already happen between these two countries, how high would you say the stakes are for this particular meeting?
So I think for the stakes for the trading relationship, probably not the highest. Again, because there is a relatively strong relationship already between the two different free trade agreements. I think the biggest issue here is going to be how the two countries coalesce and whether or not they can agree to kind of work together in terms of negotiating with the American government, especially on the sectoral sanctions. I mean, the auto market in particular is one that is very heavily diversified between the three different countries, with one vehicle often crossing a dozen, 24 times between the three before it's completed. So I think getting aligned on autos in particular is incredibly important to the Carney government and also to the Sheinbaum government in Mexico.
Rather than negotiating new deals between themselves, they're aligning strategies to handle American trusts. De-disruptions, particularly in the integrated auto sector where vehicles cross borders dozens of times before completion. Both countries are leveraging existing agreements like CPTPP to maintain trade relationships that exist completely outside of America's sphere of influence. The economic damage from Trump's reckless policies is already showing. Canada's economy shrunk by 1.6% in the second quarter of 2025, largely due to falling exports, and its unemployment rate ticked above 7% in August. But here's what Trump doesn't understand. Every crisis creates opportunity, and Canada is seizing this moment to transform its entire economic model. Carney's response has been masterful. Rather than begging Trump for mercy like previous Canadian leaders, he's building Canada's economic independence piece by piece. Canada's public procurement is following outdated rules of free trade order that no longer exists, Carney said. For years, we have been buying significantly from foreign suppliers for short-term gain. Now, we need to use government procurement using Canadian taxpayer dollars to spur Canadian businesses for longer-term prosperity. This Buy Canadian policy isn't just symbolic, it's revolutionary. The federal government, along with all of its agencies and crown corporations, Carney said, will be required to leverage every dollar the Canadian government spends to help the domestic economy. The policy replaces the federal government's best efforts to buy Canadian with a clear obligation to do so. Meanwhile, Trump's tariff chaos is destroying America's own economy. In 2025, Trump's imposed and scheduled tariffs will increase federal tax revenues by $171.7 billion, or 0.56% of GDP, making the tariffs the largest tax hike since 1993. The tariffs are larger than the tax increases enacted under President Barack Obama and President George H.W. Bush. That's right, Trump's tariffs are actually the biggest tax increase on American consumers in over 30 years. But the real genius of Canada's strategy lies in its global pivot. Prime Minister Mark Carney says the federal government will launch a new trade diversification strategy this fall to strengthen existing relationships and open new markets for Canadian businesses, particularly in Asia. This isn't just about finding new customers, it's about building a completely new economic ecosystem that doesn't depend on America's increasingly unstable political system. The European connection is particularly promising. In June, Carney signed a strategic defense and security partnership with the European Union, opening the door for Canadian companies to participate in the $1.25 trillion ReArm Europe program. That's more than $1 trillion in opportunities that Canada now has access to. Opportunities, ties that exist completely outside of America's economic sphere. Economic experts are sounding the alarm about the unprecedented nature of this crisis. The old rules of North American trade are dead, and Canada must adapt or die.
Will launch their official review process and consultation process. That's an indication that this is a president that still wants to salvage his own deal. And we need to work towards making sure that happens, because that is job one right now, preserving access to the United States, not just for our own economy, but primarily because of investment into our country comes because we provide access to the U.S., because we give them a chance to sell to the G1 economy. So that's clearly job one. Secondly, they have to figure out how is it that, this level of public sector spending is unsustainable. Not only is it about the cuts, but even the programs that are being announced, the measures that are being taken through Bill C-5, the major projects office, the infrastructure bank's going to play in that, EDC will play in that, all these others. What we want to see is a macroeconomic climate, a policy framework that says private sector investment is what we need most of. It's the engine of our economy.
Armin, can I get you to respond to that? The last word goes to you. And just also on the labor market, we spoke to Stephen Polaz earlier this week, who indicated, like, often when the labor market starts to show in the way that it is, that unemployment is rising, it's just the beginning of, like, the trend has already started kind of thing. Like, you're not going to all of a sudden pull back and see a massive change the other way.
I'm afraid that when I listen to Goldie, I think this would all be fine if we weren't dealing with Trump. Because no renegotiation of CUSMA or anything else, we're not going to save the trade deal. We've gone through the looking glass. We are not integrated with the United States anymore, to the extent that we have had to jack up our defense spending. So if you think spending's out of control, but you don't want more spending on defense, you got a problem, because that's the world we're now in. We're in a world where maybe Russia is going to...
As one economist warned, Canada is no longer integrated with the U.S. as before and faces challenges including potential conflict risks. The country is not in a normal business cycle, with businesses uncertain whether to shutter or relocate entirely. This fundamental rupture in Canada-U.S. relations requires robust federal action rather than austerity. Trump's response to Canada's success has been predictably petty and desperate. In interviews, Trump said that his suggestions to annex Canada were serious and argued that the U.S. trade deficit with Canada was essentially a subsidy, and that Canada would be much better off in the United States. Trump has argued that Canadian statehood would make tariffs totally disappear, lower Canadian taxes, and make the country more secure militarily, and called the Canada-U.S. border an artificial line that looks like it was done with a ruler. Let that sink in. Trump's trade war has been such a disaster that he's now openly talking about annexing Canada. That's not the behavior of a confident leader. That's the desperate flailing of someone who realizes his policies are backfiring spectacularly. Even Trump's threats against China are backfiring spectacularly.
Well, exactly. He did on India, all right? He did on India, and it had no effect. The Indians have said, forget it, we're going to continue to buy Russian oil despite the tariffs imposed on them by the United States. On China, it's a very different degree. the Chinese import the most of Russian oil, and the Americans depend very much on Chinese trade bilaterally. So if they impose tariffs on China for goods entering the United States, this will have a significant impact on the American economy and American consumers. So Trump has never actually followed through on this. He's been saying that this has been going for weeks now, but he's pulled back. So because that is impractical. So basically, there are very strict limits as to what the United States and Europeans or Canadians can do to actually affect the Russian economy.
India has already ignored U.S. tariff threats and continues buying Russian oil. China imports the most Russian oil globally, and imposing tariffs would significantly impact American consumers and the economy. Trump has been threatening this for weeks, but hasn't followed through because it's impractical, highlighting the strict limits on what America can actually do to affect global trade flows. The agricultural sector shows just how Canada is using Trump's policies to build new industries. The government will introduce a new biofuel production incentive with over $370 million for domestic producers to address immediate competitiveness challenges, amend clean fuel regulations to support the domestic biofuels industry, temporarily increase the advance payments program interest-free limit to $500,000 for canola advances, and provide increased funding for the agri-marketing program to support diversification into new markets of agricultural products. Perhaps the most telling sign of Trump's failure is how his own allies are abandoning ship. "We had a very good call," Trump said Friday in the Oval Office. "We are working on something. We want to be very good to Canada. I like Carney a lot. I think he's a very good person." This is the same Trump who was threatening to annex Canada just months earlier. Now he's desperately trying to sweet-talk his way back into Canada's good graces. The court challenges continue to expose the illegality of Trump's approach. The U.S. Court of Appeals ruled that the IEEPA tariffs are illegal, but they have been allowed to continue while the case is in appeal. Since then, several new tariffs and tariff investigations have been threatened, initiated, and imposed, and at least 5 court cases have challenged the legality of the tariff executive order. No court yet has ruled in favor of the unlimited emergency tariff authority Trump claimed. Even Trump's own justifications for the tariffs keep changing. Analysts and foreign governments expressed confusion over the administration's tariff strategies and openness to negotiation. Trump varyingly stated that tariffs would be lifted following trade negotiations, retained to tax foreign goods to fund government spending, or used to discourage imports. He literally doesn't have a coherent strategy. He's just throwing tariffs around and hoping something works. The human cost of Trump's policies is becoming impossible to ignore. 1 in 4 Canadians are experiencing food insecurity, a level never seen before in this country. It's an issue of affordability and one that tariffs and the ongoing trade uncertainty threatens to make worse. Between January and May, Canada's manufacturing sector lost 54,000 jobs, and the country's unemployment rate rose to 7%, the highest it's been since 2016, excluding the pandemic. But here's where Trump's cruelty becomes Canada's opportunity. Every job lost to his tariffs, every family struggling with higher prices, every business forced to adapt. They're all proof that Canada's old economic model was fundamentally broken. At one point in the campaign, Carney went so far as to proclaim that Canada's long and deep friendship with the United States is over, and the country must figure out how to prosper in a radically different world. The infrastructure investments alone show the scale of Canada's transformation. Liberal leader Mark Carney promised $5 billion for new infrastructure to help Canada to shift trade away from the United States. This isn't just about building roads and ports, it's about building the physical foundation for a post-American Canadian econ. Oh my! Canada's pivot to Asia represents perhaps the most significant shift. The economic prospects of Canada, and especially opportunities such as critical minerals, clean technology, and agri-food exports, hinge to some degree on access to markets in Asia. Carney's government can choose what he has termed a clear-eyed engagement, protecting Canadian national security and human rights interests while mapping trade and investment relations cautiously. The critical minerals sector is particularly important. Canada remains positioned as a central actor in mineral resources, with the potential to serve the growing needs of European and U.S. defense and new energy mineral needs. A natural advantage in trade talks with partners. Further efforts to strengthen the remainder of the value chain, building out refining capacity, for example, will complement Canada's resource advantage. The manufacturing sector is undergoing a complete transformation. His administration has committed to bolstering Canadian manufacturing through targeted investments in automation, advanced technology, and skills training. The goal is to make Canada less reliant on imports for essential goods like semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and clean energy components. Canada is literally building the industries of the future while Trump wages war on the past. Perhaps most importantly, Canada is modernizing its approach to trade for the digital age. Furthermore, Carney is seeking to modernize the country's trade policy to reflect the realities of a digital economy. This includes addressing e-commerce, digital services, and data sovereignty in trade agreements to protect Canadian businesses and consumers. While Trump fights yesterday's battles with yesterday's tools, Canada is preparing for tomorrow's economy. The regional response to Trump's tariffs shows just how comprehensive Canada's transformation is becoming. The government will expand support to SMEs to $1 billion over 3 years, with flexible terms and increased new non-repayable contributions to eligible businesses impacted by tariffs across all affected sectors, including agricultural and seafood. This isn't just emergency relief, it's strategic investment in Canada's economic future. Even Canada's relationship with its own provinces is being transformed by Trump's aggression. Carney's approach to imports and trade also includes a critical look inward at Canada's own fragmented internal market. Interprovincial trade barriers have long plagued Canada's economic efficiency, making it harder to transport goods across provincial lines than to some international destinations. Trump's trade war is forcing Canada to finally fix problems it should have addressed decades ago. The timeline of Trump's escalations reveals a pattern of increasingly desperate behavior. On July 11th, Trump announced in a letter sent to Carney that the U.S. would raise the tariffs to 35% starting August 1st. He cited the retaliatory tariffs imposed by Canada against the U.S. as the main reason, as well as the continued flow of fentanyl into the U.S. from Canada and the trade deficit with Canada. Trump's excuses for his tariff war keep getting more absurd. Mexican cartels are increasingly operating fentanyl and nitazene synthesis labs in Canada. A recent study highlighted Canada's heightened domestic production of fentanyl and its growing footprint within international narcotics distribution. So now Canada is supposedly responsible for America's drug crisis too. Trump will blame anyone except himself for the consequences of his failed policies. But here's the beautiful irony. Even as Trump escalates his attacks, Canada is winning the economic war. Due to the USMCA exemption, as of August 2025, over 85% of Canada-US trade and 84% of Mexico-US trade remains tariff-free. Trump's own trade agreement is protecting the very trade relationships he's trying to destroy. The global response to Trump's trade chaos has been overwhelmingly negative. In the United States, Trump's initial decision to impose tariffs on Canada and Mexico was criticized by the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, which said that his justification for this economic assault on the neighbors makes no sense, and that Trump had begun the dumbest trade war in history. When even the Wall Street Journal is calling your trade policy the dumbest in history, you know you've reached peak incompetence. Canada's strategic patience is paying off brilliantly. On August 22nd, Carney announced Canada would drop many of their retaliatory tariffs by matching the USMCA exemption in order to jumpstart trade talks. This wasn't surrender, it was strategic brilliance. Canada removed the excuse Trump was using for his escalations while continuing to build its alternative economic relationships. The results speak for themselves. While Trump's America becomes increasingly isolated and economically unstable, Canada is building a more resilient, diversified, and sustainable economy. Instead of attempting to get along with Washington, Canada is now embarking on strategic autonomy with an emphasis on resilience and diversification. This will probably lead to increased Canadian investment in strategic domestic industries, the acceleration of energy independence plans, and the enhancement of relations with other trading partners to reduce exposure to U.S. economic coercion. Trump's tariff war was supposed to make America great again. Instead, it's making Canada stronger, more independent, and more prosperous than ever. Every tariff Trump imposes, every threat he makes, every tantrum he throws, they all just prove that Canada's future lies beyond America's increasingly chaotic orbit. The transformation is already underway, and it's unstoppable. Canada is building the economy of the future, while Trump clings desperately to the failed policies of the past. In trying to punish Canada for daring to defend itself, Trump has accidentally given Canada the greatest gift possible, the motivation and justification to finally break free from American economic dominance once and for all. Thanks for watching. If you want to see how other countries are responding to Trump's trade chaos, check out our other videos. And if you want to stay updated on how Trump's policies continue to backfire spectacularly, be sure to subscribe for more in-depth analysis of America's ongoing economic meltdown.